Every spring, news is always filled with stories of the latest flooding in provinces like Manitoba, New Brunswick, anywhere around the Great Lakes, and yes, even in British Columbia, brought on by the warming season. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. Today, we dive deep into just what happened in the Fraser Valley back on June 8th of 1948, this day in weather history. Now that this podcast is over a year old, we've had the chance to explore an entire seasonal cycle of freeze, thaw, freeze again, and, you guessed it, thaw again. So which it comes as no surprise that each year, when the snow melts quickly in the warming sun, the waters rise along the Fraser River, making their way to the Salish Sea. While each year brings its issues and challenges, the 1948 floods still hold the record as the region's worst flooding in living memory. Although preparation for the flood started in late May of that year, we pick up the story on June 8th as flooding was already in full swing. Homes had already been lost, military aid was scrambled to assist, and residents were still a long way from even considering a rebuild. The Fraser Valley was hit with a catastrophic flood that spring, a disaster that left a third of the region overwhelmed by dirty water. The signs were there in late May of 48. An enormous snowpack coupled with an unusually warm late spring sent disastrous amounts of snow melt into the valley. Preparation got underway fast to evacuate and be ready for the worst. It wasn't long before the Fraser River overflowed. Preventative planning and flood protection are critical since a major flood today would have severe social, economic, and environmental consequences. So let's look at what still stands today as the worst of its kind in BC. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. But oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Problems were fast and furious. Debris and strong currents made it difficult for those attempting to evacuate. Canadian Armed Forces were dispatched to help fix overwhelmed dikes and lay more sandbags. The Red Cross was called in to provide fresh food and clean clothes to rain-soaked and exhausted evacuees. From Chilliwack to Richmond, the deluge of water that rushed down the Fraser River in 1948 has yet to be surpassed. The statistics of that year were off the charts. First of all, it took 10 lives. More than 2,300 homes were destroyed. 16,000 people were forced to evacuate. Many livestock and crops were lost during a time back then when the area relied heavily on agriculture. At its peak, the water level was measured at 7.6 meters. But the speed at which the water raced was the more horrific reality. Water was said to be moving at 15,200 cubic meters per second. This was a major league torrent. The water broke through dikes and flooded more than 50,000 acres, about 1/3 of the Fraser Valley floodplain area. In Surrey, the lowlands from Bridgeview and Port Mann and up to Barnston Island, Port Kells, and Tynehead were hit extremely hard. Abbotsford, Chilliwack, and Mission were easily the hardest hit. Rich farmland disappeared beneath a sea of filthy brown water. Hundreds of houses were also swallowed up. The floodwaters had also covered the railroad tracks, severing any rail transportation from Vancouver and effectively isolating southwest British Columbia from the rest of the country. Personal rowboats were the only means of transportation in the northern stretches, which brought with it several understandable challenges as well. It was a total and complete level of devastation. Damage was estimated at what would equate to about $210 million today. It would take years for the agricultural region to recover, but we learned a lot from this, and the 1948 spring flood changed the way the region saw the Fraser River. Towns invested more in flood prevention work to prevent another catastrophe like the one that included the events that happened on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is June 9th, and because spring is the season of the flood, we're going to stay with that theme. We will jump back to the year 2002, when 1 million houses were destroyed and over 13 million hectares of crops were damaged in the devastating floods of Hubei, China. That's tomorrow on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.